Welcome to the Melting Pod, stories about our dysfunctional immigration system and where we go from here. As your co-hosts, we've served inside the federal government for 2 decades and 4 presidents of both parties.
I'm Claire Trickler-McNulty, and I focus on ICE and immigration enforcement.
I'm Amanda Baran, and I work mostly on humanitarian-based immigration and immigrant women's issues.
I'm Doug Rand, and I focus on work-based immigration and U.S. citizenship.
So I don't think there's any question that the border was a huge issue during the Biden presidency, one that in some ways consumed the entire immigration debate, discussion, et cetera. So I think there's a lot to unpack. When we look at what really happened, I think there have been some efforts to really simplify the mistakes and make it seem like it was clear missteps. And I really think that what happened over those 4 years, looking back, was there were certainly governing failures, but there were lots of things that were much more complicated at the moment.
It's so daunting to talk about the border because not only was it an extremely difficult policy challenge, an operational challenge, it kind of metastasized into this extremely toxic political issue throughout the Biden administration, certainly during campaign season. And even now, I think there's a battle for the narrative of, well, who screwed this up? There's an intra-Democratic Party fight that's still ongoing, looking for individuals to blame. Kind of a, well, I'm not going to say witch hunt, but we're going to go deep behind the curtain on what actually went on to the best of our knowledge. But spoiler alert, you're not going to get to the end of this and think, oh, okay, I know who the good guys and the bad guys are, right? That is unlike everything I've read on the border in the past year, including a New York Times expose that I think got a lot of play right before the new year, which, kudos to the journalists for interviewing 30 former administration officials. But at the end of the day, I think it was simplistic, like Claire said, and hopefully we can go a lot deeper together. Like this poor New York Times investigative journalist talked to over 30 former administration officials, and almost none of them were willing to talk on the record. So here we are, and we're all going to talk on the record. And we have this amazing guest today who's going to be with us for a 2-parter episode. Her name is Charanya Krishnaswami, and she was a senior advisor to the Secretary of Homeland Security throughout all 4 years of the Biden administration. I think this is a voice that has not really been heard up until this point.
Yeah, and she's one of the smartest people I have ever worked with. She really cares about the people that the policies affect and really centers them. She's strategic. She is brilliant in my view, and I had the pleasure of working with her the 2 years I was in the Biden administration, and it was wonderful.
I just want to co-sign what Amanda said because she was really wonderful to work with. A lot of people in my experience who came into political positions from outside of government don't really want to roll their sleeves up and dig in. And Charanya 100% dove right in, tried to get into the issues, really understood it, and is absolutely one of the smartest people that I had the privilege of working with over the 4 years in the Biden administration.
Yeah, and she really did listen to the smart career people who cared about, good policy. She didn't come in thinking she knew everything. She really listened, she learned, and, I just think she's fabulous.
Circling back to DHSism, to what Doug started with, that this is just not simple. There's no clear picture that I think you can get out of this other than there were a lot of smart people trying to make good decisions, and there were some smart people making bad decisions.
Yes. So we're not apologize. We're not here to burnish the Biden administration and say that mistakes were not made. We're also not here to throw up our hands. I think one reward, if you stay with us, aside from the fact that Charanya is just wonderful to listen to, is if you stick with us till the very end, we do have some concrete ideas on what to actually learn from our shared experience and what a future administration who was not sociopathic would do at the border, knowing what we know now. Today, we're going to talk about Biden and the border. And I think it's a painful topic for really most people, wherever you fall on the political spectrum, because things did not turn out well by really any reckoning. It was a humanitarian crisis that was not well managed. It was a moral crisis. that was not consistently upholding our values. It was an operational mess, and it ended up being politically toxic. And I think millions of people all over America and beyond still desperately want to know what actually happened and why didn't seemingly otherwise competent, dedicated people do a better job, quote unquote, fixing the border. And so we are not going to be able to answer that question in the next 5 minutes or even in the next episode. Hopefully we'll come to some satisfactory conclusions at the end of this two-parter. And I'm really thrilled by our guest host today.
So with that, let's get into it.
Charanya, how are you?
Hey, Doug. Hey, everybody. Good to see you all.
I had this terrible idea today that if anybody uses an acronym, we have to pay $10 to a far-right restrictionist group.
No. I think we should start the acronym bucket to a good group.
But then our incentives will be all messed up. Yeah. No acronyms is the bottom line.
We should have an acronym jar.
Yeah, an acronym jar.
To pitch in.
Yeah.
You have to pitch in if you break the rules.
Sounds good.
I love it. So swearing's totally fine, but the acronym jar.
Swearing is awesome.
Okay.
Yes. But no acronyms. Acronyms are the new swearing. The other thing that we're hoping for with this episode in particular, and others in the future, is that with this episode in particular, this is fundamentally a post-mortem. The hot take on the Biden administration is that immigration was his Achilles heel. And I don't know that we're here to contest that really. But the question is how and why. And we're hoping that this episode will be the kind of real deal post-mortem that you just can't get anywhere else. So that's why we're lucky to have Charanya here. And also Claire, who was in a lot of rooms where things happened or didn't happen throughout the 4 years of the Biden administration. So why don't we start by having Charanya introduce herself to those who don't know her, who will now have the good fortune of learning more about your background and how you came to this work.
Thanks so much, Doug. It is such a pleasure to be on the inaugural episode of The Melting Pod. Huge fan of the name. As Doug mentioned, my name is Charanya Krishnaswami. I am a lawyer by training and am here in my personal capacity, actually on maternity leave at the moment with an adorable 4-month-old who is napping. Lawyer by training, primarily worked in asylum and humanitarian spaces as a litigator, as a policy expert, and spent 4 years in the Biden administration working in the Secretary's office at the Department of Homeland Security. And here we are today. So I'll leave it there.
Let's go back, if it's not too painful, to January 20th, 2021. Joe Biden's inaugurated as the next president of the United States. And you walk in the door when?
So I started in February of 2021. So about 3 weeks after the start of the Biden administration, maybe about a month.
And Amanda, you were there on day one, right?
I was at USCIS on day one.
That's an acronym, Amanda.
Sorry. Oh my God. Already. I was at the immigration agency that gives out immigration benefits. And I know that word benefits is also strange too, but I don't know how else to describe what it
is. Immigration services.
There we go. Immigration
right there in the name.
U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. I walked in day one. I was the first and only employee there, and I had a lot of
first and only political employee.
Yes. Thank you for
20,000 regular civil servant employees.
Yes. And I had to do some things very, very quickly in the first hours that I was there to stop some of the things that the Trump administration had left to flourish on the vine. So,
and you had to make them die.
I had to make them die, but a story for another day. Some of them are not dead and continue to live on. But anyways.
Mm-hmm. And then Claire, what was your day one?
So I was at ICE day one. We also had a few surprises that we walked into. But I would also just note that that was really in the height of COVID. So it was sort of strange times, and it was a strange, not as in-person process and transition into the government. And all of the ICE employees were pretty much still remote then. So it was different, right? And they had been through the whole world, country, et cetera, had been through a lot with COVID. So I just think the environment of that moment in January 21 was different than prior transitions in.
And we were all fully remote from each other too. I think that's like we were like this on Zoom calls, having these really intense conversations about all kinds of, invasive species policies that were living on the vine, to use Amanda's analogy, and having to talk about what to do and also get to know each other as people in this really chaotic and fraught moment. So
so when I said, when did you walk in the door? You didn't actually walk in the door. You entered a Zoom room. That is remarkable.
Yeah.
She walked into the Teams.
walked into
Yeah, you walked into the Microsoft Teams. For those who don't know, the federal government decided to go with Microsoft Teams and not Zoom for the entire time we were there. And I don't know, I got used to it. I'm not going to.
So the White House did use Zoom for a while, and then like Google, there was like all of the
The White
options.
House couldn't make up its mind.
Every
White House
agency had its
used Zoom.
preferred video conferencing technology in a beautiful metaphor for what it is to do interagency policy. It's like, let's all agree on like a format to talk to each other.
I had to get an exemption from the head of IT to get Zoom on my ICE computer so that I could attend White House meetings. It was wild. Bureaucratically wild.
So, Charanya, what was it like? You virtually walk in to this job. Previously, you were not in government, right? So, was this your first job in government?
First time in government, other than a clerkship, which, is its own ball of wax, but first time in the executive branch for sure. And it was the first time for a lot of folks. I think a lot of folks were, repeat players. Amanda and Claire, I know you'd served in previous administrations, but many of us had come from the outside, and this was sort of our first time in government, again, at this really fraught and chaotic moment where we were trying to figure out like what were the policies that were put in place, because there were, you all might remember, these like last ditch efforts to make policy as Trump 1.0 was walking out the door, and sort of figuring out how to prioritize. A lot of ink has been spilled about the deportation moratorium that was issued on day one, and that of course predates my time in the Biden administration, but I think it very much was sort of a wow.
By like 3 weeks.
By about 3 weeks. But I think the intent of that was to sort of say, okay, like all of this stuff has happened. I mean, we're seeing this now, right? With people being kidnapped in the streets in broad daylight, daycare teachers, grandmas. And it was very much an effort to say, hey, let's press the pause button, figure out what is going on here, and how do we put in place an immigration enforcement and immigration policy that aligns with our morals, our values, and our laws. And that was really what we were trying to do in those first days.
Got it. And so something that I think a lot of the conventional postmortems say is that Biden immediately reversed Trump's immigration policies. And some people were fans of that, and some people are questioning that. But what did that actually mean in that time and place? Like, did Biden immediately reverse everything or not?
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised this question, Doug, because I think there is this misconception that government, you flip a light switch and all of a sudden it's like, okay, we've stopped all the policies, we're doing our own thing. And that's not at all how things work. I'm sure a lot of people wish that was how things work to some extent, because it would be a lot more straightforward to get policy across the finish line. But what we were walking into was a morass of different policies at the border and in the interior that we were working to untangle and figure out. And what we put in place in those early days, and this was, a series of White House executive orders, in early February that sought to sort of put into place a vision and a set of ideas and a set of policies that we were going to work towards. But no, it is absolutely not the case that we walked in and all of a sudden all the Trump administration policies were halted. In fact, I would argue it was quite the opposite, that a lot of those administration policies stayed in place while we sorted through them and sort of figured out what our tack was going to be on this critical and tricky set of issues.
I think the most important one of all those, which when I came in, I thought we would immediately move away from Title 42, but we didn't. And I don't know if you want to talk about what Title 42 was and the decision to keep it. I mean, I think that was a really critical decision, was to keep Title 42 in place. And that set up a lot of cascading outcomes, more so than the deportation moratorium, which never happened.
Right, exactly. And yet it carries so much blame for something that didn't actually really go into effect, was immediately enjoined, was not further challenged, and just kind of sat there as this this like bête noire of the like pundit class.
Wait, but just sorry to clarify. So day one, temporary moratorium on deportations, but then a bunch of Republican attorneys general file a lawsuit and it almost immediately gets blocked. So that's what you mean, it never actually happened?
That's right.
It never happened. Not for one day.
Okay. So so back to Title 42, something people may have heard of, maybe not, assume they haven't. What is Title 42 and why?
Yeah, so Title 42 it refers to the section of the U.S. Code that deals with public health issues. So, Stephen Miller, architect of immigration policy under Trump 1.0, now, firmly ensconced back in power, making his most, evil dreams come true. When the COVID pandemic hit, he used that as a pretext to basically shut down asylum at the border, using this arcane provision of Title 42, again, the public health code, a provision that hadn't really been tested before, but he basically turned it into an immigration enforcement proviso, saying that anybody who came to the border would be immediately expelled because they could potentially be carrying COVID. That was basically the thrust of the policy. And so where before somebody who came to the border and said, hey, I'm afraid for my life, I'd like to seek asylum, would be put into a process to do that, a process called expedited removal, which we can talk about. When Title 42 was put in place, instead, they could summarily be expelled without any kind of a hearing or any kind of an adjudication of their claim. So it was basically a way to speed up removals, which were called expulsions because they had no legal effect. And so that provision was in place, I want to say, starting in the spring of 2020 and remained in place when the Biden administration came into power in 2021.
Can I just add one side note on Title 42 and how it worked? One thing that, it's important to understand about the border in general and Title 42 is Mexico's role. And so even though we have this law saying we're going to just expel people, they are going to be immediately just basically, bounced out rather than going through a process and removed. That did come down to Mexico because Mexico had to agree, right, to receive.
You're saying we have a large neighboring country that has its own autonomy and sovereignty and
that we share a 2,000-mile land border with, right. and yet, don't often consult.
Anymore.
Yeah, but so by and large, a lot of the population, Mexican, Central American, was able to be subject to Title 42 and bounced out. But then there were different populations that Mexico would not take back that we couldn't expel that then had to go through different processes.
Like who?
Individuals from the Western Hemisphere. There were, I don't know, Sharon, do you remember? I know there were like excluded categories.
Yeah, notably unaccompanied children were a category of, would-be arriving migrants who were excluded from Title 42. Yeah. But it primarily applied to those folks in the Western Hemisphere who could be quickly either expelled to Mexico. But again, to Claire's important point, Mexico would have to agree to that, or in some cases could be expelled to home country. Again, if the receiving country was willing to accept them. So there's this like really important diplomatic relations part of any kind of immigration control that often gets overlooked when people are like, why didn't he just shut down the border? Like it's so much more complicated than that.
Right.
So individuals coming from like Russia or China, Afghanistan, we were not able to expel back under Title 42 and they would come in.
Charanya, you talked about like, why didn't Biden just shut the border? It's like the question, right? But when people say shutting the border, I think most people have no idea what they mean when they say that. They're imagining like a fence or like a gate or a drawbridge or something. So can we pull back like pre-COVID, even under Trump 1.0? People forget this. Pre-COVID, the number of people coming across or attempting to come across the border without permission was quite high and increasing every day. And so that was pre-Title 42, pre-COVID. What are the rules? Like why under Trump himself, with all the horrible things he did to try to dissuade people and deter people from crossing the border, and none of them clearly were working, like why were people able to come across the border in the first place? What does it mean to have a closed border?
Right. It's a great question. I think the people who demand it don't really know the answer to that, to your good point. You're absolutely right that in the height of Trump 1.0 cruelty at the border, talking family separation, remain in Mexico, where tens of thousands of people were stranded in some of the most dangerous parts along the border to wait for their immigration court hearings, that people continued to come. And that 2019, after family separation, after the implementation of Remain in Mexico, saw what was then a high watermark of border crossings. So certainly, the push factors are a large part of it and cannot be discounted, but I feel like they often are in these conversations. Humanitarian crises, the unspooling economic and social political crisis in Venezuela, for one, global migration being on the rise around the world. And, economic factors as well. Obviously, the pandemic saw an economic depression across the region that then started to lift as COVID itself lifted and as restrictions on travel lifted as well. But to your question, Doug, about why was it that people were still able to come even with these draconian measures in place, the answer is twofold. One is the push factors, and the other is that our law does enshrine the right to seek asylum at the border. So this comes from a history in which we turned away people fleeing a genocide. And so we put it in our laws that a person who came to the border, because they were afraid of persecution on account of something, a fundamental characteristic to themselves, would have the right to have their case heard.
And that's anywhere on the border. That's not just the port of Pewee. That's wherever you get apprehended.
You just use an acronym.
That's not like just showing you at airports or showing you I'm just saying, like, it's the law is very clear that you can request asylum.
However you cross, wherever you cross, with or without permission. Once you're across, you can assert a right to asylum, and you have to have some due process. And even under the Trump administration, when I'm looking at the numbers here, it was over 4,000 people a day were being encountered by Border Patrol. They still got their day in court, basically. I mean, the Trump administration had not shut it down.
Most of them were coming in. They were being either processed for expedited removal or given a notice to appear. And so they would have been shuffled sort of through immigration detention and then put into the kind of, at that point, not quite as big as it is now, but still very large immigration court backlog.
Yeah, I'm not saying it was awesome for these people. I'm just saying that even Trump could not, quote unquote, shut down the border until COVID hit and they came up with this pretext, this nifty pretext in Title 42. They're like, oh, well, instead of going under the immigration laws, we're going to make this hard shift over to public health law, which no one's ever done before. And we're going to say, oh, well, we're going to treat people as presumptively a public health risk and just turn them back. Unless, of course, Mexico won't let us. But for the most part, we're going to try to turn them back with no due process. So they could literally have someone pursuing them. This is a gross metaphor. I don't mean it this way, but I want to make it real for people because, Charanya, something you just said right now, I think it's so important. Anyone who says, oh, just shut down the border needs to think about the St. Louis during World War II, right? Like, that's why we have a right to asylum. It's one of the reasons, right? Jewish refugees fleeing Hitler's Europe and got to, we're like, could see the United States. And we're like, please, we're claiming asylum, let us in. And we turn them away, and most of them were murdered. And they weren't, quote unquote, exploiting the system or exploiting a loophole or what have you, right? Like, that's why we have these rights. And yes, this is a wicked problem when you have over 4,000 people a day showing up and claiming asylum, and nobody knows how many of them have clear the bar and how many of them don't. But it's something that is incumbent on a country to figure out. And Title 42 was this dark magic trick that said, nope, we don't care who you are, where you come from, or what the validity of your claims. We're turning you away based on this obscure public health authority.
That's right.
Yeah, it was a bit of a two-step, though, with Remain in Mexico. Like, there was the first effort said, well, you're going to come and we're going to let you claim asylum, but you're going to wait for your court hearing in Mexico. Again, where Mexico agreed. So that you didn't get to come and wait for your day in court in the U.S. You had to wait in Mexico. And they were working that out. And then COVID happened. And Title 42 was massively more, I think, impactful on sort of like border operations, but
it was way less work to say, whereas previously under Remain in Mexico, which everyone will remember from the infamous camps that sprung up along the U.S.-Mexico border, then candidate Biden being asked about the conditions at a debate and saying that was un-American, and just how notorious that policy was. It also required a lot of paperwork to get people into immigration court, to transfer them to the United States for their immigration court hearings, then back to Mexico to wait for their next hearing, and then to go from that to Title 42, basically saying anyone who doesn't have permission to come, because that's the other thing that's so crazy about Title 42 is that there were tons of people who were crossing the border. They just weren't people who were seeking asylum. They were not public health threats, but the people who were seeking asylum were. They could just be summarily expelled and turned away. And so that was a lot more straightforward from a processing perspective, a way lighter lift. And so I think that was, a big reason why the Trump administration adopted it.
So back to your first day, February 2021, or actually before your first day, you're getting ready for your first job in the executive branch, and we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're in the middle of this, all kinds of different overlapping crises. Did you expect that among the things that the Biden administration would reverse on day one would have been Title 42? Were you surprised that they didn't?
And again, just like speaking purely for myself, I was of two minds about it, not in terms of like, did I think it was a good idea for it to be in place? Like, no, I absolutely don't. And I'm happy to talk about why. But at the same time, I know that the fear of the pull factor looms so very large in the minds of policymakers and the pundits who influence the policymakers. And I think the idea of losing this very potent border control on day one probably really spooked people. That's, again, just me surmising kind of based on the situation. But as Claire and I were just talking about, this was an expulsion with no legal consequences. So what we started to see were the same people trying again and again and again to cross, which in turn inflated border crossing numbers, which made the border look like a bigger crisis, which made it harder to lift these border controls like Title 42 and put into place the policies that we wanted to see that were fair and efficient and also led to final decisions. And instead, what we were seeing was this, one person being apprehended 4 or 5, 6 times, families self-separating at the border because, as we mentioned, unaccompanied children were excluded from Title 42. So we started to see an uptick in the number of unaccompanied kids who were coming alone, which was another, huge humanitarian problem that we faced in early 2021.
Wait, so for those of us who are not super expert, like pre-COVID, pre-Title 42, you come to the border and there's consequences that you don't have under Title 42, where you can just come again and again and again. Like, what's the difference?
That's right. So Claire mentioned expedited removal, which was the sort of process that was in place pre-Title 42, where a person would essentially be removed without a court hearing unless they said to the processing agent that encountered them at the border, I'm afraid to go back. And then they would have what's known as a credible fear interview, where they would be assessed, where their fear of return would be assessed. And if they were found to have a credible fear, meaning that there is a chance that this person could qualify for asylum, they'd be referred to a full court hearing before an immigration court. So that was the process that was in place.
But if not, what are the consequences?
They could ask an immigration judge to review it, which would happen quickly. And then if the judge agreed with the asylum officer, then they were removed. And that whole process could happen quite quickly.
And just a note, this idea of credible fear oftentimes is talked about as a loophole,
Yeah.
And I just want to say that, like, when expedited removal came down, credible fear was put into place, and a very low bar to, being able to say you had a credible fear was also put into place, because we wanted to make sure that we weren't sending people back if they were going to be persecuted in their home country. Like, so it was on purpose a low bar so that people could clear it and then have enough time to present a full asylum case before a judge. It's something that a lot of policymakers in the Biden administration and even now are challenging about whether or not it's too low, and we're giving all these people access to asylum. So I think it's just important to set that out.
I'm going to be the audience stand-in here. There's something I still don't understand. Let's say somebody crosses without claiming asylum, pre-COVID, pre-Title 42 versus during COVID, Title 42. Like, what's the difference? What is the actual consequence?
So they get processed for expedited removal, and they get removed. Then they have a removal order, and they'll have a significant bar to return. Title 42, it's basically just they were, recording who they are. That's how we knew we had multiple encounters, but they're just bounced out. They come back, get bounced out again. They do not have a removal order on their record and the immigration consequences that flow from that.
And I think this has an interesting political consequence because, I talked to friends of mine who are certainly not MAGA Republicans who are like, well, I mean, isn't it true that Biden let in 10 million people? It's like, well, wait, where did that number come from? Well, I think that number comes from total border encounters, certainly not the number of people who were let in, but, you have this, the unintended consequence of Title 42 was people just kept trying again and again and again because there was no downside to trying again and again and again. You've gone through hell and back to try to make it to the border in the first place.
And they're not being removed to their home country, right? Like a lot of them are just
they're not home.
Bounced out into Mexico and northern Mexico, right? It's easier to try again and hope that you make it through than, to make your way home.
Mm-hmm. And it was also hugely profitable for smugglers, right? So now you're getting multiple thousands of dollars from the same person over multiple attempts, as opposed to the previous case where a person would come once and be put into this expedited removal, maybe credible fear process if they articulated a fear and if that fear was found to be credible. Hardly the generous, open borders policy that it's often caricatured as being, right? But Title 42 absolutely artificially augmented these numbers. That's the thing that I find so maddening about this whole debate, is that this thing that ostensibly closed the border actually led to these inflated numbers. And it was, this signature initiative of Stephen Miller that the Biden administration kept in place for 2.5 years. So that's really, something that people need to sit with and think about when they say, wow, on day one, Biden waved his magic wand and, lifted all these policies.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is that you walk in on day, 27 or 21, and there are all of these things happening at the same time. There's Title 42, there's Remain in Mexico. You mentioned unaccompanied children coming to the border, just overlapping things happening, plus COVID, right? We forget, COVID was in full swing. We didn't have vaccines back then. It wasn't available for everyone. And so those were kind of the border dynamics at the time. And you all were trying to figure out how to respond to all of them. I guess like what I want to know is like, how did the courts play out in all of this, given that we were trying to deal with these policies that were left over from Trump? Like, what are the kinds of things that we did, and how did the courts hurt or help us in any of this?
Yeah, I mean, Doug, I think, mentioned this like effort by Republican AGs to run to court on day one to halt the moratorium. And I think with everything that we did do, there was constantly the specter of litigation, predominantly from this like group of red states. And then also, I think on the other side, later on, efforts to restrict asylum, I think were also challenged by advocacy groups, as standing contrary to the law, which enshrines the right to seek asylum, regardless, to Claire's point, of where you are seeking it along the border. And so litigation, I think, created this like stop-start effect that added to the perception and the reality of chaos, which is to say, on one day, this policy is in place, on the next day, it's been halted, and now, the Supreme Court lifted the stay or stayed the order, depending on what direction it was going in. And that dynamic was absolutely dizzying. And I think the uncertainty absolutely fomented this perception of chaos.
Just to add to that chaos, I want to talk about what happened in Del Rio in September of 2021. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened and how it changed the outlook of the administration or impacted the outlook of the administration?
Yeah, I do think that was an inflection point. And again, just taking us all back to the days of 2020 and COVID and George Floyd and this like reckoning with racism and policing, and then seeing what happened in Del Rio, both, the numbers of people who were coming to this historically very untrodden border crossing. It's like in a very small town. That is a dynamic too. I want to make sure folks understand is that we were seeing more crossings along parts of the border that had historically not seen these sorts of numbers. And so even small numbers could be overwhelming, when it's a small border town. And in this case, I believe it was, in the thousands, right, of predominantly Haitians coming to the border. And then, of course, no one can forget the imagery of, Border Patrol officers on horseback and what that looked like and symbolized for people. And again, kind of adding to this narrative of, oh my gosh, this is a chaotic situation. It is out of control. There are people we don't know who are infiltrating our border. And then on the other side, look at this policing and look at the sort of imagery and like the history that it evokes, just seeing these images of.
For people who don't know what those images are, can you like describe them? Because I remember the first time I saw them, I was shocked. I visibly gasped.
Same. I think I was probably on a Teams call, just in terms of probability. The many hundreds of thousands of hours I spent on Teams calls with colleagues when I saw those images come in, and just feeling my heart like catch in my chest. Like you and all of you, and I'm sorry I'm getting emotional here because I feel like we joined government because we wanted to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, to correct the excesses and the evils of the past administration, and then to see something like that happening on our watch. These officers in uniform, like sitting high on horseback with what appeared to be whips, but I think were actually reins. But again, like these reins, we're parsing the details. Right, exactly. They were reins, but like again, it's Amanda, to your point, like the imagery, and then just what appeared to be like hundreds of Black asylum seekers who they looked like they were trying to control. I'm not even really sure, what was going on. There was like a detailed professional responsibility report that came out later, but it was a moment I won't forget.
But how did that change the conversation inside government?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly put immigration front and center. And mind you, while all of this was happening, we didn't even really touch on the unaccompanied children and the increase in them coming to the border in, February, March 2021. But that was really like the start. And so you had the right-wing media machine that was like obsessively following the border numbers, just creeping up and creating this like, just spinning up this narrative of border out of control.
Yeah, and like using dehumanizing language too, right? Like swarming and flooding,
Yeah.
Totally. Even the word like influx, as though this is like these are, I don't know. It was just, you're absolutely right. I think the dehumanizing language became so normalized because again, you have this like right-wing media machine.
And the mainstream media was using this dehumanizing language too. I don't think with the same evil intent, but they were just picking it up.
Yeah, for sure. Because it was almost like the the narrative was being created in the right-wing media and then being picked up and echoed and reverberated. And then all of a sudden it was, a real thing that we were dealing with on the inside. But certainly Del Rio, I think, just threw into high relief how complicated and messy the situation had gotten.
To ask a kind of uncomfortable question, we're remembering our reaction to that moment and this infamous photo of the white Border Patrol officer on horseback pursuing a black man, running away from him. I think a lot of people in the United States saw something very different, which was 14,000 black people living in squalor under a bridge on the U.S. side of the border, and invasion, influx, call it what you will. It triggered some of our ugliest instincts about invasion. And it's a weird split screen moment, I think. And I'm curious to what extent, going back to Amanda's question, like, what was the debate? What were the reactions? What did you see on the inside in terms of how policymakers reacted?
Yeah, I think it really crystallized for folks that, wow, people think the border is out of control. And having 14,000 people under a bridge in a historically not very traversed part of the border and having to contend with just imagine the humanitarian challenge of that, right? When you're at this part of the border that historically people don't really cross, and then all of a sudden you are dealing with this significant number of people with serious humanitarian challenges. That is something that is really, really tough. What I remember Del Rio as, one, of course, the admin did the right thing in terms of the professional responsibility investigation and all of that. I think that was important. But I think it crystallized for folks that this is an issue that the public is perceiving as completely out of control. And having that many people in this place, that is a crisis. That is really challenging.
I'll just note for the record, since we're talking about this, the question was sort of what happened internally. I think that the photos and what was seen was certainly emotionally triggering. The response from even the very highest politicians in the land sort of condemning what they saw, I think was seen internally by Border Patrol as a betrayal. And there was a lot of anger. And I heard a lot of anger at ICE and in Border Patrol about the public reaction and the statements that were made. And I think it turned, in some ways, some of the officers even more hostile to the administration.
I'm so glad you raised that, Claire. I feel like this is where either the combination of maternity leave plus just trauma blocking this part of our, shared history. But you're absolutely right. I think there was this sense that even the questioning of what the agents on horseback were doing was a betrayal. I remember the Hamed Ali-Aziz reported on the sort of challenge coin that had been created to commemorate what the officers on horseback had done. A challenge coin for those who are not in the know is
they're basically created by law enforcement agencies, and they're normally gold or silver, two-sided. They'll say whatever the group is and then something more specific about them, and they're sort of traded around. It's not formally given to you. It's passed in a handshake. And it's sort of this law enforcement token that is shared as a friendly gesture.
But Hamed had reported on this particular challenge coin that was unofficial, obviously unsanctioned. And I'm looking at an image of it now. It says, reining it in since May 28th, 1924, which was the date Border Patrol was founded. Yesterday's border is not today's border. And there's a depiction of a man on horseback. And that, I think, encapsulates so much of the challenge, which was that we were coming in, trying to do things humanely, correctly, in line with the law. And then, dealing with this, with people who would put out an unofficial challenge coin like this and think it was funny and consider any kind of investigation into unprofessional behavior an affront to their mission. And that was such a challenge.
Yeah. Well, so given all of this, we spent a lot of time talking about, what we confronted and what was going on at the border, but there were some solutions that the Biden administration was trying to craft. And one of them was the asylum officer rule. I think the technical term was the asylum processing rule.
We're so good at branding in government.
So good at branding.
We're so good.
I was have you heard of our AOR? Because it's now called an APR. Don't get too excited.
But Charanya, can you talk about that a little bit? What was that trying to do?
Yes. I'm so glad you asked, because I feel like the asylum officer rule, APR, AOR, whatever we want to call it.
We're not going to call it that.
We're
going to call it the asylum officer rule every damn time.
So this was part of, I think we alluded to these series of early February executive orders that sought to kind of set the tone the policy and the vision on immigration for the administration. And one of the EOs directed DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice to promulgate, which is a fancy word for kind of like publish and put into effect, the asylum officer rule, which would empower asylum officers. So we talked a little teaser moment for you with the discussion about credible fear interviews, but asylum officers do these credible fear interviews. Individuals usually don't have legal counsel, which is another, I think, important reason why, it has a low threshold before the full-scale hearing. But the thinking was, why not empower asylum officers who do asylum adjudications in the affirmative context for people who are not in removal proceedings, as opposed to immigration judges who do asylum hearings for people who are subject to detention and deportation. Why not have those asylum officers who are trained, who are well-versed in the law, do both the credible fear screening and then the asylum merits interview was what it was called.
And that's basically like interviewing them and adjudicating their asylum, right?
That's right. Exactly.
Like all at once. It's like, I got you, you're in front of me. I'm evaluating the credibility of your claim for protection, and I'm evaluating at the credible fear level. Well, if you pass that, why don't I go on to the final level and figure out once and for all right now in one interview whether you get to stay or you have to go.
That's exactly right. So it wasn't all in one fell swoop. It would still have been 2 interviews.
But Charanya, it is an idea that's been out there for a really long time, right? That's been proposed to multiple administrations over many, many years, right?
Yeah. I would say, expedited removal, like the thing that created the credible fear process in 1996, like it's basically been like an idea since I think expedited removal was put into law. So it's been, bandied about for a long time. And this time around, the admin really put pen to paper, and it was a very intense process, drafting that rule. But
sorry, the admin meaning the Biden administration, not a secretary.
Correct. Yes. Sorry. Biden administration. Thank you. I will put my $10 in the jar accordingly.
Actually, that wasn't an acronym, so you get a free pass on that.
So I think, if I were to describe this to, again, your average pundit, they might say, okay, why does this make such a big difference? It makes a huge difference for a couple of reasons. For one, folks have heard about our enormous, decades-long immigration court backlog, which has just grown and grown and grown. It grew under Trump. It grew more under Biden. But, unlike the Trump administration, I'd argue the Biden administration made some concerted efforts to cut down the backlog in a way that respected due process. And the asylum officer rule was one. It was a gambit to, instead of sending yet more cases to that lengthy backlog, which critics have said just incentivizes people to come claim asylum, skate by on this low threshold and then, spend 10 to 15 years, an indefinite number of years in the United States to instead have their cases adjudicated quickly. And what I think folks who work in the policy space but haven't represented asylum seekers don't understand is asylum seekers also want quick answers on their cases. Nobody likes uncertainty. I remember representing folks in detention who were literally they were weighing their own liberty against the idea that they may not have an answer on their case for years. So their asylum, application could be adjudicated within 6 weeks if they were in detention versus question mark if they were released from detention, which is a horrible trade-off to have to make. So I want to correct the record on that because I feel like a lot of folks think of this backlog as this luxurious bubble bath that asylum seekers are just taking in. And it's nothing could be further from the truth. Yeah. Everybody wants quick answers. And so the thinking was, instead of waiting for, years to decades to have an answer in one's case, one could instead be adjudicated by an asylum officer and have an answer within 45 days, which I think, again, may not be fast enough for the critics, but would be so much faster
that's
than
ludicrous speed. Yeah.
So that's the positive part of it. Were there any parts of the asylum processing / officer rule that maybe were more of a compromise?
There were a lot of questions, and you'll see the shift from there was a proposed rule and then a final rule, which changed a lot. The proposed rule had the entire process living under this and this is going to get wonky. I'm just already going to I'm going to proactively invest in the acronyms jar for this one. But it basically had the whole process living under expedited removal, which the Supreme Court has said there is no judicial review of. So even if an immigration officer just categorically made a mistake, the person said, I fear persecution based on X. So, and that is a cognizable basis for asylum. And the immigration officer said, yep, sorry, nope, you're denied. There's no review of that. And the Supreme Court said that is hunky-dory, A-OK, that's just fine. And so there were a lot of questions about whether or not there should be federal judicial review of the asylum officer's decisions. And you'll see that the proposed rule said there wouldn't be. And then the final rule created a kind of different system where there would be some limited judicial review.
But just to clarify for folks, in the regular asylum process, there is judicial review available.
That's correct. That's correct. So
Yeah,
this was just aligning the asylum officer rule process with the general process, which does contemplate some judicial review, which again, for anyone who's been in immigration court, that is a critically important safeguard. Very few asylum seekers actually exercise it, but it exists as a sort of check on the whole system.
That would be your response, presumably, to those who would say, like, well, it's redundant. Like, why would you go through this whole process with an asylum officer? And then if you don't get the answer you like, you just go to the federal courts.
Keep appealing. And so I'm sympathetic to this idea that the timing of the administrative part of the process is in our control, right? Like we can say, asylum officer, you are expected to render a decision in this case within 30 days. Like that's something you can do. But you can't say, hey, federal courts, we expect you to get back on this, petition for review within a month. That's not something that we as the executive branch could control. So I am sympathetic to that. And I'm sympathetic to the intent to answer the call to decide these cases more quickly, which I think was really kind of animating this whole process.
So it was kind of like a compromise, right?
And also, Amanda, that even the idea of building any part of this process under expedited removal was something that a lot of people criticized. Like a lot of people think the expedited removal process that has been in place since 1996 is itself riddled with due process violations and flaws and causes a lot of people who have credible fear to be summarily denied. Like that is, I think, a legitimate and valid criticism and something that we should contend with too. And so I think you're absolutely right to frame it as a compromise. It wasn't like an advocacy wish list by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah. No, exactly. I remember being around that time and being a little bit involved, not at all as involved as you, but that whole process involved people like you and a lot of wonderful career employees who knew a lot about the process. And it also involved people who did not know a lot about the process, but who were there to, quote unquote, get things done and move things along. And so I think, the way I remember it, the process was a little more tortured than it had to be. But we finally did get to a place where the rule came out, right? And it was, a huge priority of the administration. Like the White House really wanted it to come out. And so then, wow, look, here's an answer. Like, how did we implement it after that?
As I recall, it fixed everything.
That's how it was sold, right?
Yeah.
Right. So this is also the problem when you're like, one side's entire immigration platform is build the wall, and ours is like, well, it actually takes a complicated, that's just a hard place to start from. And so I think a lot of people put a lot of early hope into the asylum officer rule. But as with all things, and I think this is not something we've touched on because it's like possibly like the most boring word to deploy in a podcast, but like infrastructure, man, like it's actually really important. Whether it was Title 42 and people moving away from expedited removal, which requires a lot of processing, to like, oh, I'm just going to send them back across the border, no processing. Like we had to rebuild that muscle. And then there was the entire unaccompanied child reception apparatus, which had been completely dismantled under the Trump administration, which we basically had to build from like night to day. And then with the asylum officer rule, like we were talking about a sea change in how we process these applications. And like, of course, you're not going to see all of a sudden like thousands of cases being adjudicated within 45 days. These things took time. We pursued at like a phased implementation where we started very small in a couple of, detention facilities with single adults as opposed to families, and then very, very, very gradually expanded. But I think as with all things, there was frustration that the pace of change wasn't happening quickly enough. And so, that is just a plea for policymakers in the future to let the good ideas be implemented and like take their time, because the big one worth waiting around for.
I guess this is something that struck me as somebody who was a career and then came back as a political, just how much it takes to make even small changes and all of the things and all the parts. Like part of the AO rule was doing a transcription of that initial interview and just getting the ability to just transcribe it. It was a massive lift and like slowed things down. And it was, part of why it had to be such a small rollout. And you would think it's not that hard to transcribe an interview. It is at scale.
You would be wrong.
Yeah, you would be wrong.
Yeah. Should we also drop the procurement word on top of info? We're like,
no. I was being facetious before, but I mean, is it fair to say that this whole hoped for solution died on the vine at the end of the day?
I feel like it didn't get its chance. Like, I think that there was this sense that it was taking too long. It was too slow. There was confusion about whether or not it was actually, in fact, a carrot or a stick. And so...
Carrot or stick? That was the question.
And we can get to that in a second. But I think there was this idea that these were people who were crossing between the ports of entry, like doing the thing that the administration wanted them not to do. And then they were being fast-tracked for an asylum hearing. Like, I think there was a sense of like, what's going on here? And I think there were the same personnel challenges. Like, I think a lot of officers who were kind of tasked with implementing on the front end, there was like a sense that this was just way too carroty, like this idea that people would get quick asylum hearings. But the intent was very much to get to quick yeses for those who qualified and quick no's for those who didn't. And that is exactly what policymakers and pundits say that they want to see. So yeah. So I would say I think it suffered from underinvestment and it wasn't given the time it needed to sort of flourish.
And we never had the money to really pull it off, did we?
I think that's right. And I think it was going to require a lot of money. And I do think there were these unhelpful sort of narratives or ideas that we would charge quote unquote legal immigrants for like the cost of the asylum officer rule, which like talk about fomenting a lot of not disagreement, but just kind of a lot of resentment between immigrant groups. I think that was certainly a challenge as well. But it was one of those things that I think like the money could have been found if there was the will to see it through and make it work.
Claire, you were kind of shaking your head on that question.
Well, I mean, I guess I was saying from my perch, there was a lot of hostility to it because I think the numbers were so high and they were going up and there was just, nothing that even had the slightest whiff of being a pull factor. Sharon, you were talking about push factors before, but there's this perpetual fear that you're going to incentivize more people to come to the border. And I guess it seemed like there were a lot of people who were in positions of power who thought a fast asylum process was just going to continue to up the border number. So there wasn't a real interest in implementing it.
So basically, we started kind of have the first phase of the Biden administration's reaction in the first year or so. And now it sounds like you're describing a kind of vibe shift on the inside of, like, how would you describe it? Like, we're not going to touch anything that even smells like it could possibly incentivize anyone to come here without permission. And we're going to have an invitation-only set of policies. Charanya, can you talk about that pivot? If you agree that was a pivot?
Yeah, no, I think it's fair to say that there was an appetite for harsher restrictions. And the asylum officer rule wasn't a restriction. It was like a processing reform that would make both the thumbs up and thumbs down faster. Like that was sort of the idea. And importantly, we haven't touched on this yet, we were directed in the executive orders to articulate who was eligible for asylum in the form of this particular social group rule, social group of the...
Sorry. Too good to live. Too good to live.
But like, I do think this point, like, I know, again, it sounds very wonky, but we never articulated who should be eligible for asylum. And that's such an important part of having this system, like being able to say, we do want to continue to be a safe haven for those who are persecuted on account of something they cannot change about themselves. And like, let us tell you what that is. That was something the administration never did. And so there wasn't really like a moral theory of the case.
There was in the beginning.
There was in the beginning.
Yeah.
For some of you.
Well, yes. But some of us were dropped in more hostile environments than others, but
I think to the vision point, those details, the vision thing, we did put into place, enforcement priorities for ICE and a sensitive locations policy and put an end to worksite enforcement. And like, we are seeing in real time the human cost of not having those policies in place. I would argue that those were very successful efforts that allowed like kids to sleep safely in their beds at night. Those are the things I am proudest of, like having played a part in of everything we did. And I hear your point about like, there were challenges.
There was ups and downs. There were challenges with getting interest in ICE. Those things were all good, but those things were all done within the first 6 to 9 months, right? There was, the following 3 years, you didn't see a lot of vision on interior enforcement.
I think the vision was numbers going up, make number go down.
Yeah.
Correct. It's like success means low numbers, failure is high numbers. It almost felt like there was nothing more to it than that. And again, I understand the challenges and I understand like having to make policy in the face of this very like hostile right-wing media apparatus that like just gleefully covers like any shift in border numbers and, loves to talk about it and like spin up a lot of hatred. I mean, there's a reason that immigrants are constantly scapegoated for problems in countries. Like that has been happening since time immemorial. So like, I don't mean to minimize the very real challenge of that. But I think you were right to not have a policy vision beyond numbers need to go down. That's a playing field we're always going to lose on because you have a you have a White House in place that is like actively embracing white supremacy and like that. Yeah. Like, are they going to win if the debate is border numbers are bad? Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like we need more of a moral content to our border policy and our immigration policy writ large, Amanda, to your point.
Just bring back to where you started, Doug, on the St. Louis. The history of asylum is there's a lot of moral clarity on why we have the laws the way we do. And I think ignoring that, like moving so far away from that we just let the politics of the border demonize all of it is not a winning place to be.
Yeah. Okay, so now it's 2022. Totally independent of anything to do with immigration. We now have vaccines. The pandemic is on the wane. And the president at some point has to officially end the pandemic declaration. Right. And so that has this consequence for immigration, which is that the moment that those emergency authorities end, the entire legal purpose for Title 42 evaporates. And so, like it or not, Title 42 is going to end. Everybody knows what day it's going to end. And so as a result of that necessary public health change, there's going to be this dramatic change in terms of how we treat people at the border. What did that feel like as that date was hurtling closer?
I mean, I think there was a lot of fear, panic, just consternation, just the idea. And, and certainly it is the case that smugglers have gotten really sophisticated. Info does spread like wildfire. So the idea that a headline like border restrictions lifting, like the chaos that could create, I think that was a very real and acute fear for sure. And then there was this added challenge of we've been using Title 42. We've become reliant on it. How do we go back to this world of using expedited removal, which again requires more processing time, more steps by the line level agents, more coordination with like different agencies in the process? That was going to be a sea change. We just weren't set up for it, needed to sort of build up towards it. And the other thing that I think we haven't totally made clear for listeners is just like how many moving parts there are. Like, it's not just a question of like one agency's got to do this one thing. It's like this agency's got to talk to this agency's got to talk to that office, got to talk to this. And so like it was this massive coordination effort across every agency that touched the border in some way, whether that was the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, Health and Human Services, like you name it, everyone sort of had a piece of the process. And so there was like a very, robust preparation effort, I would say, that was undertaken, but certainly a lot of fear about what the end of Title 42 would portend for border numbers.
Right, we got ginned up multiple times for Title 42 to come down. Like there was hundreds of hours of people's time preparing, and then it didn't happen. I think it was like 3 times we thought it was going to end.
Again, the red states ran to court to try to like stop us from lifting Title 42, even though, Doug, as you noted, like the reason, and I put this all in like gigantic quotation marks, the reason for Title 42 was over and like vaccines were available. So this like idea that only asylum seekers could bring COVID to the U.S. border was now, it was never real, but like it certainly was now moot in the face of vaccines. And so again, Amanda, I think you'd asked a question earlier about just like litigation and the complications that it added. And it certainly did create this like stop-start, like, okay, it's ending. No, it's starting. I think there was initially an effort to try to like phase out Title 42 gradually, which I think certainly would have been the better way to do things. So to kind of make sure that like every part of the border was prepared for its end and had its processes in place so we could do things slowly and on our own time. But that's not how things ended up going down.
Indeed.
That's a strange part of this story that probably will never be told, but because of all of the pressure on the border through all of these people coming, tons of things got a lot better, right? Like how the A files like went from paper to electronic. Sorry, alien file. Like that's what, when somebody comes in, it's like the file of their record. Doug and Amanda know this better than I do, that like follows them through their immigration process, right? But those were always paper files, but there was like a huge push to make them electronic, to make it faster to process people as they came in. The way that ICE and CBP communicated was awful and slow. And there were all these efforts of like tagging cases of exactly when they were handed off between the agencies to find all the loopholes. We're wonky territory here, but like there was so much that was happening that made everything so much more efficient to allow for like better handling of and different handling of cases and processing. It sort of allowed like some of the stuff that happened at the end of the administration to happen that really hasn't, I think, was not really worthy of public notice because it was all just process improvements.
One way to frame that would just be like, listen, it's so easy to say, why didn't you just move faster? right? Like, look at Doge. Look how fast they move. But like, it's so
fast
much.
and flawlessly.
It's really easy to destroy something. It's really hard to build something. And that's not an excuse. And that's not to say that things couldn't have moved faster and better. And there's a lot of mistakes were made and we're going to catalog them in gory detail. But like, it is hard to move the battleship, even in a crisis where everyone's focused. We might want to, make this a two-parter, and the cliffhanger will be like, Title 42, the end is approaching. What's the plan? What was the plan? Inside the administration, what were people saying? All right, well, we know there's going to be this overnight sea change in how we legally have to process people at the border, but here's the plan. What was the plan?
Expedited removal.
If that was the plan, then we could have done that in January 2021.
Absolutely, in part.
Yes. And I think one thing we haven't mentioned is just the increase in the numbers in where people were coming from and how unusual that was to history. So like that, I'm gonna quickly note that people were coming to the border from countries where we hadn't historically seen like large numbers. Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba was a big one. And these are all countries with which the U.S. has no diplomatic relations, right? And so you need diplomatic relations in order to effectuate someone's return. And so what effectively started happening was that these were people who could not be subject to Title 42, who were, coming to the United States and couldn't really be removed. And all of this is happening and these numbers are increasing. And then Title 42 is about to be lifted. And so that was sort of like the complex, I think, set of dynamics that were taking place almost simultaneously. And so, as I mentioned, it was a coordinated effort to sort of say, we got this, we're going to do this. And part of that was putting in place an asylum restriction that looked a lot like a Trump-era restriction, which was basically saying anyone who crossed through a country that was, even if only in name, party to the Refugee Convention, which binds that country from sending back a person who fears persecution. If a person had transited through one of those countries, then they would effectively be denied asylum in the United States. And so that was kind of meant to be the strong stick that accompanied this, like the lifting of Title 42 to ensure that people didn't just come to the border all at once.
Right. And the thinking behind that was that, well, they should have applied for asylum in that country. Like they're going through all these countries where they can like apply for asylum to come to America. You should have applied there if you're like really afraid.
Right.
Right. But so doesn't that mean, effectively speaking, you can only apply for asylum at the southwest border if you're from Mexico?
So you could only be, the way the rule, this new policy was structured was that if you were from a country other than Mexico, effectively, you would be subjected to this like presumption that you were ineligible for asylum. And you could overcome that by saying, actually, I was persecuted in Mexico, the country that I crossed through to come to the United States, or there's some other like really compelling reason why I should be allowed to seek asylum in the United States. But what it effectively did was render people ineligible for asylum, but they could still qualify for a lesser form of relief called withholding of removal, which is kind of like the skim milk protection. It is time-bound. It is required to be like renew. You have like a work permit that you're required to renew every year. It can be revoked.
This is what Kilmer Abrego Garcia had, right?
That's correct.
So there's no path to a green card or citizenship. And then it is a specific withholding of return to a country, but does not prohibit return to other countries.
And just for folks who don't know, Kilmer Abrego Garcia is a man who is from Maryland, but is a national of El Salvador, who had the protection that Charanya and
the skim
Claire
milk
and Doug,
protection.
the skim milk protection, who was erroneously sent to that horrible, horrible human rights disaster prison, CICOT, not sure what it stands for, but the horrible prison in El Salvador that is being run by, the government and holding people at our request for money that we are giving them. And it's a human rights abomination.
It is and shockingly horrible. But yes, withholding and again, taking like a little wonky detour here, the important thing to remember is just, as Claire was saying, withholding of removal is like, it does not lead to any kind of permanent form of relief, but we are required to assess people for withholding of removal. We can't return them without doing that. And so asylum has these, under the statute, there are kind of like discretionary like bars that can be put in place. Withholding of removal doesn't have those discretionary bars. And that's why even somebody transiting through these countries even if they were rendered ineligible for asylum, they could still apply for this lesser form of relief that has a higher threshold, no pathway to permanence. And yeah, so that was kind of the thinking.
That was supposed to snap in when Title 42 ended.
That's right. And it was supposed to be paired with like limited, very, very limited pathways to come to the United States through this like permission structure that you alluded to, Doug. The idea was that people would have to apply for permission in advance using this mobile application called CBP-1, where they basically say, it was almost like a lottery of sorts that they would try to enter. And if they did, they would be told to present at a certain port of entry. And then there were also the parole processes that came into place in like starting in 2022 and moving into 2023 that we can also talk about.
We will talk about that later.
And just to distill it in terms of like narrative, the narrative was that there was a ton of chaos that we had talked about, like lots of chaos. And then there was a decision to control the chaos, right? And this was one of the ways that the administration decided they wanted to control that chaos. And instead of just like letting people come to the border, like people need access to our country. So we're going to figure out ways to give them access that don't involve just coming to the border. So you said CBP-1, and then you mentioned the parole. And then you also mentioned all the different groups of people that were coming to the border who had not before come to the border. Can you also talk about Ukrainians? Because there were Ukrainians coming to the border, right, too?
Yeah, there were. So, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we started to see an increase in Ukrainians coming to the land border while Title 42 was still in place. And so there was a sense of like, oh my gosh, these are people fleeing this like unprovoked war. They can't be turned back.
Just to be clear, they're fleeing their homeland in Ukraine and somehow ending up in Tijuana.
That's right. In Tijuana, I think largely in Tijuana, along other places at the U.S. border as well. And also, seeking refuge in multiple countries, not just the U.S. And that's like such an important thing that I think we kind of like solipsistically forget. Like there are many other countries where people are also seeking asylum, often in much greater numbers than the U.S. proportionally. But, conversation for another time. But yes, Ukrainians were coming to the land border. And there was a sense of like, what do we do? Like, if we let them in, then we're going to see, like maybe many more people coming. It's going to be like, more unchecked migration. But at the same time, this, is a population that has a lot of sympathy in the American eye. So like, what can we do for them? And the answer was Uniting for Ukraine, which was this effort to basically identify sponsors in the United States who would basically say, like, I want to help support a Ukrainian asylum seeker refugee person come to the United States. And so there were sponsors and then Ukrainian beneficiaries who came to airports again instead of land ports. That was another, like, I think important innovation of the parole processes was that these people were not coming to land ports at all, but instead were arriving at airports, already having had the sort of like thumbs up that they could come. And so, so this was started with the Uniting for Ukraine effort, which was massively successful and popular.
Yes. And can you tell us what parole is? Like, what kind of status is that? Like parole, as like most people know, is like, associated with the criminal legal system. But immigration parole is different. Yes.
Totally different.
Yeah, this is like, I think
also branding.
On par with benefits is like a terrible immigration.
It's the worst.
Yet again, just excel at being the worst.
We should just call it permission. It's just permission.
It's
temporary permission. When you parole, think temporary permission.
Correct.
It's not a visa. It's not a status, but it's temporary permission to come here and stay here.
That's exactly right. It leads to nothing in terms of your ability to formalize or, attain permanent residency. Like, you have to have another avenue to be able to do those things. What it basically allowed people to do was to come to the U.S., seek asylum potentially if they chose to, if they became eligible for temporary protected status, which again is a temporary protection for people who are fleeing conflict, natural disaster, war. We designated Ukraine for temporary protected status. So some people who came in on parole were subsequently eligible for that or eligible for asylum. But essentially, it's like a temporary permission to come to the U.S., a safe haven, and be here for, usually the paroles that were issued were for, I think, 2 years, in some cases 3, depending on the type of parole, in some cases much less time than that. But it's basically, think of it as a way for the executive branch to sort of say, there are all these laws and restrictions and particular pathways that exist. There is also the ability of the executive branch to say, it is in, public interest for this person to come in for this period of time. So it's kind of sort of like a stopgap and a catch-all is how I would describe it.
Right. And so you have Uniting for Ukraine, which is allowing people to be paroled in. But before Uniting for Ukraine, there were also people who were paroled in at the border. There were Ukrainians who were being paroled in at the border.
Yes. Yeah.
Before all of this, because that's kind of what led to, I think, the creation of Uniting for Ukraine. But I just wanted to draw our attention to just like one thing. And I remember that This American Life had done a really great episode on it, but it was talking about the different populations from different countries who had been amassing on the border and how the Ukrainians were getting paroled in, but then other populations, Central Americans who were all sitting at the border were not. And I don't know if we can link This American Life episode in the show notes.
In the show notes, we'll totally have show notes.
But it was such a great episode because it interviewed people who were in shelters who were not Ukrainian, talking about their experience in shelters on the Mexico side of the border versus how Ukrainians were treated. And it was a very, very stark racial, like a description that, I don't know, that also really struck me when I heard about it, was watching people who've been sitting there on the Mexico side of the border for a really long time, and then watching these people who are not brown and not from Central America or South America get like express entrance into the United States. I mean, that felt very stark to me.
Yeah, no question. I think that there was, even in the public perception, it's like compare, we spent a while talking about Del Rio and just like the imagery and the hearkening to like this history's racist past, and comparing that with kind of the reception and both, even this idea that, oh my God, there were so many people who wanted to come out and like sponsor Ukrainians. And there was like such public momentum and pressure to set up this policy and such resounding agreement on the inside to do something like this. And why can that not be created for other groups that are also fleeing war, natural disaster, endemic poverty? There was absolutely, I think, a difference. Like, I think it was perceived and it was real for sure.
Okay. I think we should take a breath. This is terrific. Thank you so much, Charanya. Because I know like nap time, when you have a tiny baby, like nap time is your only time to yourself. And so we stole that from you and you gave it willingly for this public service. And we appreciate it.
It's for a good cause. It's for the best of causes. I'm so happy to do it. And she's been napping like a little champ. So, maybe our podcast put her to sleep.
Welcome to the Melting Pot.
Just tell you about her immigration surefire cure for babies who don't like to sleep.
You will all be shocked to learn that we do not have time to tell the entire story of Biden and the border in one episode. But the good news is we have a lot more to this conversation in part 2, which we encourage you to listen to wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Thanks for melting down with us today. You can follow and subscribe to The Melting Pod wherever you get your podcasts. Our website is meltingpod.org, and you can find us on YouTube and Instagram. Drop us a line with any questions and let us know how we can improve the show. And you can check the show notes for organizations that are working hard to make our immigration system more sane and humane and that deserve your support. So until we melt again,